in here, so you can chat if you want, or you can, if you're on the phone, unfortunately, we will unmute it when we do the Q&A. So this is one that we didn't think would get a lot of interest, patient safety. And by the way, this is Dan Sfera from the Clinical Trials Guru. I'm here with Chris Sauber.
Hello, all.
So you ready to talk patient safety, Chris?
Sure. And as you had stated, I didn't think this would be of much interest either, but apparently it is.
Yeah, apparently people want to hear about this, and we've actually never done one on this topic. So due to popular demand, we are doing it. So where do you want to start with this topic? Patient safety. I mean, let's start with phase 1 study, okay? Just to get that out of the way. That's the one that typically comes under most scrutiny when it comes to clinical trials.
But really, do you need to go by phase? I mean, wouldn't the same general rules apply to all phases?
Yes. And there's no video. Okay, our bandwidth is limited. We're audio only today. Yes, it is, Chris. So, however, for phase 1 studies, and we actually got this from a student that we were teaching. So for many of you that don't know, we have a CRA Academy, and we were going through the phases, and we explained phase 1. And the student just couldn't grasp the idea that somebody, a healthy person, would want to join a study.
Subject themselves to an experimental product.
Right. In exchange for receiving compensation. Right? We had to repeat that 3 times to this person. No, their only benefit is to get compensated. Right? The entire point of a phase 1 study is to make sure that, or to see when a certain drug starts causing side effects.
Right.
Like, it's to determine your maximum threshold for a dose of a certain drug. Okay?
Right.
So clearly phase 1 studies, I mean, safety is important there as well, but that's typically where most people, when, like traditional media, when they talk about clinical trials and they refer to clinical trial subjects as guinea pigs,
referring to phase 1.
They're referring to phase 1, when in reality that's probably less than 5% of all of clinical trials. Patients.
Clinical trial participants.
Right. Now, as you alluded to, regardless of phase, patient safety is important. And you want to get into some of that? Just some of the intro?
And the same standards apply, regardless of phase. It essentially boils down to, is the patient safe, and is there proper oversight to the patient's safety? So, for example, the principal investigator, and this is an ongoing kind of hot topic issue with the FDA, is the principal investigator providing correct oversight, or the type of oversight that they need to conduct clinical research. And really what the FDA is stating there is, are they offering the oversight to the patient's safety? Are the patients safe to participate in this trial? Are their labs being reviewed? Are any issues that arise AE-wise or other, are these being reviewed by the PIs they should? And essentially, I believe that's what patient safety boils down to. Somebody with a medical license, are they offering significant input into the patient's well-being? Really, that's what it boils down to.
Yes, and so if you're listening to this, I mean, you might be a sponsor who is considering doing their first clinical trial, or maybe one of their first of several planned clinical trials. And you may not understand the safeguards in place for study participants. So you have what's called an IRB, and typically it's up to the CROs, the contract research organizations, to manage all aspects of the trial, and the IRB would be considered just another vendor in the study, just like you're going to have a vendor for the electronic data capture, you're going to have a vendor for IWRS, sometimes you're going to have a vendor for patient recruitment, you're going to have an IRB, and that's an ethics committee, and that's an independent third party. Most sites are able to use central IRBs, but there are some sites like universities and hospitals that use local IRBs. But their role is to make sure that patients are not going to be undergoing any unnecessary risk or harm.
Right. Ultimate goal is patient safety. That's the IRB's sole function.
Yep, and they understand that there's always inherent risk, especially when you're dealing with a phase 1 study, right? But this is specifically why they are very strict in these phase 1 studies for exceptionally healthy volunteers. So if you're like marginally healthy, you're probably going to be excluded. Now, there is a gray area, right?
There is.
Yeah. Usually phase 1 studies don't have a hard time enrolling patients for healthy volunteer studies. But sometimes they get difficult, and we're going to talk about the more difficult phase 2 through 4 studies in just a few minutes. But just on the phase 1, usually they look for college students who are healthy. They're in the right BMI range. They're not taking any other medication.
Their labs are essentially perfect.
Right. And so extremely healthy, right? But sometimes you'll get some phase 1 studies where they're looking for certain biomarkers, all right, and it's all of a sudden becomes a lot more difficult to enroll patients. So the ethical dilemma there is, does the site enroll someone who on paper looks like a good candidate, but the physician knows, or maybe the coordinator knows, that the patient actually shouldn't be enrolled because there's a possible health risk?
Can you give an example?
Let's say someone's right on the border of BMI, and they don't have hypertension, but it's borderline, right? So on paper, they don't have the diagnosis of hypertension. They're not taking any medication, right? But the coordinator knows that maybe the patient told them, hey, when I drink coffee, my blood pressure goes up, but other than that, I'm okay. Well, there might be something wrong there. There might be an underlying condition that hasn't been diagnosed. However, the site, because it's difficult, may look the other way and enroll the patient.
Sure.
Right? And then you get
all the time.
Yeah, and there's nothing actually illegal about that because technically the patient qualifies. But this is why you need PI oversight, principal investigator oversight. Because at the end of the day, it's up to this individual, the principal investigator, to make sure that any study participant that is enrolled in the study will not undergo any unnecessary harm or risk. Right?
Yeah, falls on their shoulder too. If enrolling said patient, the one with borderline hypertension, if they have a coronary arrest because of their enrollment, that also falls on the PI because they enrolled that patient and they had the ultimate decision to make on whether or not this patient should participate. So it's a twofold process there. Anything that adversely affects the patient falls on the PI, and initially they're to make the determination whether the patient qualifies or not.
Okay, so phase 1's out of the way. All right, let's talk about the majority of trials, phase 2 and 3. Okay, so same ethical dilemma applies here, although more pronounced, because now there's actually a potential benefit for someone who actually has the medical condition to participate in a study. They're testing a treatment. Yes, they might get placebo. The IRB is still there to make sure that the protocol, and by the way, every protocol has to get approved by the IRB. So it's not like you can just make any protocol you want. The IRB has to approve it. And when the IRB is looking at it, they're only looking at patient safety.
And they have to approve the informed consent that will be used as well. Does it stipulate all of the possible side effects that are known and potential benefits of the study to the patient, the participant?
Hmm. And this has nothing to do with the endpoints or primary or secondary objectives that are being collected for the studies to present to the FDA. The IRB just is strictly concerned with patient safety, which, by the way, is also an endpoint. Like, you want to see whether the drug is safe in patients with that condition
Right.
at that dose and effective, right? But since this is a patient safety webinar, we're going to focus on safety. So, like Chris said, the IRB has to approve the protocol as well as the informed consent. Now, you get into a lot of ethical issues here when it comes to patients that are right on the border. Sometimes they may qualify on paper, but the PI or the study coordinator, they understand that it's very difficult to find these kind of patients. And I'm using air quotes now, they make them fit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this happens like everywhere, right? Every clinic, every research clinic. The issue is, because again, there's an ethical dilemma here. Should the patient be enrolled? I mean, there's a safety issue, and then there's just the issue of data, right? So obviously, if a patient only has the medical condition on paper but doesn't actually have it in real life, that's not a safety issue. That's a data issue, and that's a topic for a different webinar. We did one very similar to that on PI oversight, and we covered on some of these things. But when it comes to safety, all right, you get into issues of when you're taking a patient who's doing well on a certain medication, right?
Right.
And you're putting them in a study where there's a chance that they might get placebo. Well, the sponsor, the IRB, the FDA, they know that this is a potential ethical issue. So they always leave it up to the PI, right?
Yeah. I can give you a good example of a study right now.
But what happens when, and this is typically not a problem if the PI has oversight, because the PI is the final say in whether a patient should get in or not, and he or she should not be considering any other factors other than, will the patient be safe in the study? Will they undergo any unnecessary harm? Right?
Right.
Now, the ethical dilemma happens when there is very little PI oversight, right? Because then it comes down to coordinators.
Yeah.
And is there an incentive for the coordinators to randomize patients that maybe shouldn't be randomized? Maybe the PI is on autopilot.
Yeah.
So, do you have any thing you want to add to this, Chris?
Well, other than the fact that I think this occurs quite often in research, in which you have, say, like Dan had stated, a coordinator, say, who has a high school education, and they are conducting physical examinations and reviewing labs. They're not really qualified to know or make the determination if it's in the patient's best interest to participate in this trial. Even though all of those there's guidelines in place in the protocol to stipulate whether or not, say, certain lab values are accepted or not, still there may be something there that's being missed. Even though the patient qualifies from a lab value standpoint, there may be some clue that an MD would pick up on that a high school graduate is just not going to see. So of course there's that issue.
And this is why PI oversight is so important, because there are going to be these situations in which you're relying on the PI to make those decisions and that to use their best clinical judgment.
Yep.
Okay, now enough about ethics. Let's just talk about just black and white patient safety, but which also points back to PI oversight.
Yes,
all right. So lab results.
Mm-hmm.
The site receives lab results regularly from their ongoing patients.
Yes.
ECG results, like you said, vitals and adverse events, serious adverse events. Like, these are things that need to be assessed and looked at by either the PI or like a MD or DO, someone qualified to look at these things, a RN, a nurse practitioner. The problem with a lot of sites, in addition to the lack of PI oversight that is often the case many times, is they're enrolling so many patients, and combine that with a lack of PI oversight, the patient's labs really aren't, they're just being glossed over when they're looked at, right? When an astute PI or an MD sub-I who's actually looking at the lab results from the perspective of a physician who's trained to see things that we're not trained to see. Chris and I are not doctors. If we look at a lab result, we're just looking for normal or abnormal because the labs will flag these results.
Correct.
What we're not seeing and we're not trained to see are foreshadowings of certain things to come. So maybe the cholesterol is slightly elevated and it's different than the baseline lab result for this patient, but it's still not flagged as high.
Right.
Well, a trained PI would know, if they study the investigator brochure, that this may be something they need to keep an eye on for next time, because maybe that's a known side effect of this drug. Right? That's one example. And you only get that from the really good sites, like the really good, really involved PIs.
Right.
Most of the time, unfortunately, they just get glossed over. Now, pharma typically knows this. Sponsors know this. So they make the inclusion and exclusion criteria strict. So patients with chronic illnesses other than the illness that the study is targeting are usually excluded for this exact reason.
Sure. And then there's medical monitors in place as well that review lab results, and they are MDs, and hopefully they catch these things, and oftentimes they do. But again, that's just a safeguard. The ultimate responsibility is on the PI.
It's on the PI, and then that leads us into adverse events, which are any unwanted adverse event that happens to the patient while they're in the study, and also serious adverse events, ones that are life-threatening or require hospitalization, right? And other sites are now depending on your site to properly report serious adverse events, because when you report a SAE, it gets sent to the IRB, and then the IRB distributes that SAE report to all the other sites so that those investigators can be on the lookout for similar SAEs that could potentially happen at their sites. So PI oversight doesn't just affect your site and the patient safety at your site, it affects patient safety across all sites in the study. And in other studies too.
Sure.
Sometimes they do sister protocols with the same drug, right? So we need to wrap this up because we've got a call at 2:00, but we will open it up to questions. I will unmute everybody if I can. And we will see if there's questions. And if you want to type in, we can do that as well. Here, hold on, Chris. Anything else you want to add, Chris?
Well, just since you're busy trying to figure out how to unmute people and others may be typing, I'll just give a little bit of my opinion and research on the ethics side of it. For example, there's an Alzheimer's study out there right now that the drug is being tested, and it's supposed to slow or completely stop the progression of Alzheimer's. It won't necessarily reverse. It's not supposed to, but it's supposed to, again, stop or slow down the progression. This is a placebo trial. So the way it works is the patient will participate in the trial for a given time period. I think it's 2 years. Then that portion of the first 2 years is placebo. 50% receive placebo. After that, then it's open label, and all participants will receive the actual study drug. So if you think about it ethically for a moment, again, this was approved by an IRB, but is that ethical? Is that ethical? First 2 years, they could receive placebo, and the disease will progress if they're receiving placebo, right? Because Alzheimer's is always progressing. And in that 2 years period of time, they may have gotten to a point where, they don't even know their own name. Whereas the study drug, it could actually work, and they'll receive it at open label at the 2-year mark. If they would have been given that drug initially, they wouldn't have progressed to that point. The disease would not have progressed to the point where they are now. So I have questions about the ethical side of research in general as well. To me, that seems a little unethical.
Maybe that's our next webinar.
But that being, could be. But that being said, how else are you going to actually run the trial to see if this drug works or not?
Right.
So
thank you, Chris. Yeah, the clinical trial system is definitely far from perfect. We actually are in listen only mode. I cannot unmute. I should have done it in Q&A mode, but you can type in your questions, but we do have to run in about 3 minutes. So I'm going to get to one question now. Is someone saying, Chris, the disease would have progressed either way? This is research.
Well, that's not necessarily true. If the drug actually works and it stops the progression, then if they were to receive the actual drug, the investigational product, it would have halted the progression if the drug actually works. So no, it wouldn't have progressed either way.
Yeah, these things, I mean, this is why we have IRBs. This is also
why oncology studies, they're not designed with placebo.
Let's end on that one. So in the United States, if you're suffering from a life-threatening condition like cancer, they're not allowed to give you placebo. They have to give you either the study drug or the standard of treatment on the market. However, and so you don't necessarily get the separation from placebo that you need to prove to the FDA. You just get a comparator. It's a lot more difficult to separate from that, right? You have to show other benefits or more benefits. So what they did in the early 2000s was outsource a lot of these trials to India. And they argued that since there is no current standard of treatment for cancer there, and Africa, you can Google these things, they actually gave placebo there. So that is clearly unethical. And in the United States, that's not allowed, and it's no longer allowed there either in developing nations.
For diseases like Alzheimer's.
For Alzheimer's, it is, because it's not life-threatening. It's just like a quality of life thing, right? But yeah, thank you guys very much for watching. We do have to prove that the drug is able to separate from placebo. In addition to oncology, I believe another one was AIDS. Okay, from what I understand. But hopefully this helps a little bit on patient safety. Hopefully it whets your palate for patient safety. I know I'm surprised that we've got this much interest for this topic. Usually we're very businessy. But we will wrap this up because we have another call right now. All right. So thank you guys. The replay will be on. I appreciate coming on short notice. Next time I will have it in Q&A mode so we can actually hear from you when you ask questions. And the replay will be on YouTube. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate it. And we will talk soon. Bye-bye.